The hole was a wound in the earth. 20 feet by 40 feet of gaping muddy soil, it bled a damp, loamy smell into the crisp October air. It was ugly, raw, and the most beautiful thing Mark had ever paid for. For 3 days, the rumbling growl of a backhoe and the sharp crack of concrete had been the soundtrack to his liberation. Liberation from the cracked basin, the peeling liner, and the ghost of a life that wasn't his. The pool had belonged to the house, and the house had belonged to him and Sarah. Now, they both just belonged to him. He stood at the edge of the pit, a mug of cooling coffee in his hands, and watched the last of the work trucks pull away. Sati, quiet it left behind, was profound, a heavy blanket settling over the manicured lawns of Chestnut Drive. For the first time in 5 years, his backyard felt like his own. He could plant a garden, build a deck, maybe even get that dog he'd always wanted. A fresh start, dug right out of the ground. That's when he heard the sirens. At first it was a distant cry, a familiar urban lament that had no place in their sleepy suburb. But it didn't fade. It grew, sharpening from a whine to a wail, splitting the evening quiet. Mark frowned. An ambulance? A fire truck? He saw Mrs. Gable from 3 doors down peek through her pristine bay window. Across the street, Mr. Henderson paused, his meticulous leaf-blowing, his head cocked like a curious robin. The wail became a roar, resolving itself into 2 distinct, piercing shrieks. They were close. Too close. Mark's stomach tightened. The sound rounded the corner onto their street, and a nauseating wash of red and blue light pulsed against the beige siding of the houses, painting the scene in strokes of emergency. 2 police cruisers. They weren't speeding through. They were slowing down. They stopped directly in front of his house. Mark's heart hammered against his ribs. He stood frozen, coffee mug clutched in a white-knuckled grip, as 2 officers emerged from their vehicles. One was older, with a thick mustache and a weary set to his shoulders that suggested he'd seen every flavor of suburban madness. The other was younger, sharp-jawed, with an eager by-the-book stiffness. As they started up his driveway, another figure emerged, and the world snapped into a sickeningly sharp focus. Carol. His next-door neighbor appeared on her porch, wrapped in a cashmere cardigan despite the mild evening, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She had the look of a concerned citizen, a mask of civic duty painted over a foundation of pure, unadulterated malice. She had been a thorn in his side since the day he'd moved in. Complaints about his grass being a quarter-inch too long, his recycling bins being out an hour too early, the color of the trim he'd painted his shutters. The pool removal had been for her a 3-day-long apocalypse. "Markham Jacobs?" the older officer asked. His name tag read Davies. "It's just Mark," he said, his voice sounding strangely hollow. "Is there a problem, officer?" "We received a disturbance call," the younger one, Miller, stated, his eyes flicking from Mark to the gaping hole and back again. "A complaint regarding unpermitted construction and potential endangerment." Mark's jaw went slack. "Endangerment? I don't understand. I just had the pool removed. It's all licensed, permitted. I have the paperwork right inside." From her porch, Carol's voice rang out, sharp and clear. "Tell them about the smell, officer. And the trucks coming and going at all hours. It's not right. This is a residential neighborhood." Mark shot her a look of pure disbelief. The work crew had kept a strict 9 to 5 schedule, and the only smell was dirt. "Carol, what are you talking about?" Davies sighed, a long, suffering sound that confirmed Mark's suspicion. This wasn't his first encounter with Carol. "Ma'am, why don't you let us handle this? Mr. Jacobs, we just need to ask a few questions." They walked with him to the edge of the pit. The setting sun cast long, distorted shadows into its depths. Miller clicked his pen, poised over a small notebook. "So you're just filling it in?" Miller asked, his gaze sweeping the scene with a tactical seriousness that felt utterly absurd. That's the plan, Mark said, forcing his hands to unclench. Level it, put down topsoil, plant some grass. Make it a yard. And the company. You hired, Davies chimed in. His eyes narrowed. They're a reputable outfit? Fully licensed and bonded. Suburban Solutions. I did my research. They've done half the pools in this county. He was starting to feel a frantic edge to his own voice. This was insane. He was being interrogated for doing landscaping. Because your neighbor seems to believe you're disposing of hazardous materials, Miller said, his tone flat and accusatory. The accusation hung in the air, so ludicrous it was almost funny. Almost, but the two uniforms standing in his yard weren't laughing. Hazardous materials, Mark repeated, the words feeling like sandpaper in his mouth. It's a hole, an empty hole. The liner, the pump, the concrete, it was all hauled away. You can call the company right now. Their number is on the permit. She also mentioned, a foul odor, Davies added, glancing towards Carol's house. She was now standing at the edge of her lawn, a silent, triumphant sentinel. It's wet dirt! Mark's voice cracked with frustration. He gestured wildly at the pit. It rained 2 nights ago. It's October. It smells like earth. He saw a flicker of something, sympathy, annoyance, in Davies's eyes. But Miller remained impassive. We'll need to see that paperwork. Sir? Miller said. Mark nodded, relieved to have a concrete task. Of course, right inside. Let me just... What's that? Carol's voice sliced through the air again. She had crept closer, her finger pointing dramatically towards the bottom of the pit. Right there, that dark patch. All 3 men turned to look. In the fading light, it was hard to see clearly, but there was a section near the deep end, where the soil seemed darker, almost black, and wetter than the surrounding earth. It's probably just clay, Carol, or a spot where water settled, Mark said, his teeth clenched. Or it's chemicals. She shot back, her voice rising, with theatrical alarm. He could be poisoning the water table. My prize-winning roses are right there. This is a reckless disregard for public safety. Miller was now shining a high-powered flashlight into the hole, its beam cutting a sharp white circle in the gloom. The dark patch did look odd. Not just wet, but discolored, with a strange, oily sheen that the light caught. Sir, did the crew mention hitting anything unusual during the excavation? Miller asked, his voice losing its bored monotone and gaining a sharp edge of genuine suspicion. Any old pipes, a septic tank, anything like that? No, Mark said, his mind racing. Nothing. They would have told me. It would have been on the invoice. He was trying to remember the conversations he'd had with the foreman, a burly man named Gus. They'd talked about the weather, about the upcoming football season, about the sheer amount of rebar in the old concrete. Gus hadn't mentioned anything amiss. We need to go down there, Miller said to Davies, his jaw set. For God's sake, it's a mud pit, Mark exclaimed. You're going to get your uniforms dirty over a baseless complaint from a woman who thinks my wind. Chimes are a public nuisance. Davies held up a hand. Calm down, son. We have to follow procedure. The complainant used specific language, hazardous waste, toxic smell. Our hands are tied. We have to check it out. Mark watched in a state of suspended reality, as the 2 officers carefully made their way down the sloped earth into the hole where his pool used to be. The beam of Miller's flashlight danced across the muddy walls. Carol stood on the lawn, a rapt audience of 1, her face illuminated in the intermittent flashes of the cruiser's lights. He could hear the officers muttering to each other. Miller knelt by the dark patch, poking at it with his pen. Davies stood back, arms crossed, looking profoundly irritated by the whole situation. After a few minutes that stretched into an eternity, they climbed back out, their boots heavy with mud. Well? Mark demanded. Davies wiped his boots on the grass. The soil's saturated with something, has a faint chemical smell. Could be old pool chemicals that leached into the ground. Could be nothing, but it could be something, Miller insisted, looking at Mark with cold appraisal. And we can't take that chance. A cold dread heavier than any mud began to seep into Mark's bones. What does that mean? Davies looked him straight in the eye, and this time there was no sympathy, only official resolve. It means this area is now a potential investigation site. We can't have you filling it in until we get someone from the Environmental Protection Department to come take a look. For your safety and the community's. Mark felt the ground shift beneath his feet. You can't be serious. An inspector? That could take weeks. I have a mountain of soil sitting in my driveway waiting to fill this thing. That soil can't be moved either, Miller stated. It's part of the site. He walked over to his cruiser and pulled a roll of yellow tape from the trunk. Police line. Do not cross. Mark watched, impotent and shaking with a cocktail of rage and fear as the young officer cordoned off his own backyard. The yellow tape stretched from the oak tree to the back fence, a garish, official barrier separating him from his dream of a fresh start. It was a declaration. This space, his space, was no longer his. It was a scene, a question mark. As the officers finished, giving him a final formal instruction not to tamper with the tape, Mark's gaze drifted to Carol. She hadn't moved. The setting sun was gone now, and her face was a pale oval in the deepening dusk, lit by the triumphant, pulsing, red and blue lights. The sun rose on a world bound in yellow plastic. Mark woke on the sofa, a crick in his neck, and the sour taste of stale coffee in his mouth. He hadn't slept. He had watched the shadows in the pit deepen and shift as the moon crawled across the sky, transforming the muddy chasm into a place of infinite, terrifying possibility. Now, in the flat, unforgiving light of morning, it just looked like a mess. A legally enshrined, officially demarcated mess. The police tape, sagging slightly with morning dew, was the first thing he saw through the sliding glass door. A bright, ugly scar across his vision. His new life cordoned off. The first call was to the police department. He was polite, measured, explaining the situation to a desk sergeant who sounded monumentally bored. The sergeant grunted, typed on a keyboard with 2 fingers, and then delivered the first blow of the day. Yeah, I see the report. It's been flagged and forwarded. It's an EPD matter now, sir. Out of our hands. But you're the ones who put the tape up, Mark argued, pacing the length of his kitchen. Can't you just untape it? It was a ridiculous complaint to begin with. Sir, once a potential environmental contaminant is identified, protocol is protocol. We don't have the authority to clear it. You need to talk to the Environmental Protection Department. The line clicked dead. The Environmental Protection Department was a fortress of automated phone menus. After navigating a labyrinth of prompts, for soil contamination, press 3. For water table concerns, press 4. He was finally placed in a queue. Vivaldi's 4 Seasons played on a tinny loop, a cheerful, maddening soundtrack to his escalating panic. 47 minutes later, a woman with a voice drained of all human warmth answered. Her name was Brenda. Mark explained everything, his voice tight with forced calm. He explained about the pool, the neighbor, the dirt. Brenda listened, punctuated by the occasional non-committal, I see the case file was opened this morning, she said finally. Jacobs, Mark, 114 Chestnut Drive. Yes, that's me. So, when can I expect an inspector? I have a 2-ton pile of soil in my driveway, and I'd really like to get this hole filled before a neighborhood kid falls into it. A pause. The clicking of keys. Sir, we're currently experiencing a significant backlog. An inspector will be assigned to your case in due course. You'll be notified by mail of the scheduled date and time. In due course? Mark repeated, the words feeling alien. What does that mean? Days? Weeks? "It means when an agent becomes available, sir," Brenda said, her voice taking on the patient, condescending tone one uses for a difficult child. "We have to prioritize active industrial spills and known hazardous sites. A residential soil query. It goes into the queue." The finality in her voice was absolute. He was a number in a line, a file on a desk, a problem to be dealt with. Eventually. He hung up, the silence of his house pressing in on him. His next call was to Gus, the foreman from Suburban Solutions. Gus was all gruff sympathy. "That's a raw deal, buddy. A real raw deal," he boomed through the phone. "That neighbor of yours is a piece of work. Heard about her from another crew that did a roof on your street." "Tell me about it," Mark said, rubbing his temples. "Listen, Gus, what about the soil? Can your guys at least come get the pile out of my driveway? I can't even get my car out of the garage." "Wish I could, Mark, I really do." But the cops were clear. That soil came out of the potential contamination site. That makes it potential contaminated material. My guys can't touch it, and the dump won't take it without a clearance certificate from the EPD. My hands are tied. We're stuck till you're cleared. Every door was closing. Every path was blocked. He was trapped, marooned on his own property. The neighborhood, once a place of quiet, anonymous courtesy, had transformed overnight. When he stepped outside to get his mail, the street fell silent. Mr. Henderson, who was usually good for a 5-minute chat about the weather, gave him a tight, nervous nod from across the street and quickly retreated into his house. A woman jogging with a stroller made a wide arc around his driveway, pulling her child closer as if Mark's lawn were radioactive. His home had become a spectacle, a piece of local gossip. He was the crazy guy with the chemical pit in his yard, and through it all, there was Carol. She was out in her garden, snipping delicately at her award-winning roses with a pair of silver shears. She wore a wide-brimmed sun hat and pristine white gloves. She moved with a serene, unbothered grace, completely ignoring the yellow tape that fluttered just feet from her prize-winning hydrangeas. It was a performance, and Mark was the intended audience. She wanted him to see her, to see how utterly unaffected she was, to see her living her perfect life while his fell apart on the other side of the property line. She was tending her garden while his own was a gaping wound. The paranoia began to fester. He found himself replaying every interaction he'd ever had with the house's previous owner, Mr. Abernathy. The old man had been rail-thin with watery eyes that never quite met Mark's. He'd seemed desperate to sell. He'd left behind dusty furniture, expired food in the pantry, and a shed full of junk. At the time, Mark had just thought he was an eccentric old bachelor, eager to move to whatever retirement community awaited him. Now, his mind painted a more sinister picture. A man on the run. A man with a secret to bury. He spent the afternoon on his laptop, digging. But Abernathy was a ghost. No social media, no public records beyond the deed to the house, no digital footprint at all. It was as if he'd only existed within the four walls of this property. The deeper Mark dug, the more the void itself felt like evidence. By evening, the four walls of the house felt like a prison. He needed to do something, anything, to feel a sense of control. He thought of the shed. Abernathy's shed. He hadn't touched it since he'd moved in, beyond tossing his own lawnmower inside. He grabbed a flashlight and wrenched open the creaking wooden door. The air inside was thick with the smell of rust, oil, and decay. Cobwebs, thick as cotton, hung from the rafters. Piles of cracked terracotta pots, rusted tools, and half-empty bags of ancient fertilizer were stacked against the walls. It was a tomb of forgotten projects. He started moving things, methodically at first, then with a growing urgency. He tossed aside brittle hoses and empty paint cans, the clang and clatter echoing in the small space, and then he saw it. Tucked away in the darkest corner behind a stack of rotted firewood was a metal box. It was an old military-style ammo can, painted olive drab, but the paint was flaking away, revealing a filigree of rust beneath. It was heavy, far heavier than an empty can should be. A thick padlock, seized with corrosion, held it shut. His heart pounded. This was something. This had to be something. He carried it back to the house like a holy relic and set it on the kitchen table. He got a hammer and a screwdriver and started working on the lock. The metal groaned in protest. He slammed the head of the screwdriver against the shackle, the sharp impacts echoing through the silent house. He was sweating, grunting with effort, his frustration and fear channeling into this single physical task. Finally, with a loud crack, the rusted lock shackle snapped. He paused, his breath catching in his throat. His mind raced with possibilities. Deeds, stacks of cash, a confession. Slowly, he lifted the creaking lid. The box was filled with rocks, dozens of them, smooth, gray, ordinary-looking river stones of varying sizes. That was it. Beneath them was a layer of sand, and underneath that, nothing but the cold, hard bottom of the box. Mark stared, his mind refusing to process the sheer, idiotic pointlessness of it. Rocks. The secret was rocks. He wanted to laugh, to scream, to hurl the useless box against the wall. It was a perfect metaphor for his situation. A heavy, locked container of crushing, meaningless weight. He slumped into a chair, the adrenaline draining out of him, leaving a hollow ache of despair. He was tilting at windmills, fighting shadows. Abernathy wasn't a criminal mastermind. He was just a weird old man who collected rocks. Carol wasn't a brilliant villain. She was a petty tyrant who had gotten lucky. 3 more days passed. A thick, official-looking envelope arrived in the mail. Mark tore it open, his hands shaking, praying it was the notice from the EPD, a date for his salvation. It wasn't. The letterhead was from the County of Northgate Code Enforcement Division. His eyes scanned the dense, legalistic text, his blood running cold. Notice of violation and order to abate property. 114, Chestnut Drive violation, County Ordinance 7.14b, public nuisance and safety hazard, unsecured excavation. The letter went on to state that, based on a formal complaint and a subsequent police report, his property had been cited. The open pit constituted a significant hazard to public safety. The words swam before his eyes. He was being ordered to abate the nuisance immediately. And then he saw the final paragraph. Failure to comply will result in a civil penalty of $500, 500 zeros per day, until the violation is rectified. The notice was dated 3 days ago, the day after the police had been there. Already owed the county $1,500. The breath left his body in a ragged gasp. It was a perfect, diabolical trap. The EPD had legally forbidden him from touching the hole. Now, code enforcement was fining him into oblivion for its very existence. He was being bled dry by 2 different arms of the same government, each working in direct opposition to the other. He stood at his kitchen window, the violation notice trembling in his. The machine had no ears. Mark spent Monday morning on the phone with County Code Enforcement, trying to explain the impossible catch-22 he was in. He spoke to a clerk named Henderson, a man whose voice was a perfect monotone instrument of bureaucratic indifference. "I understand your frustration, sir," Henderson droned, though it was clear he understood nothing of the sort. "However, the fine is automated. A violation is entered into the system, and the system assesses the penalty until the violation is cleared." "But I can't clear it." Mark's voice was fraying, the calm he'd promised himself already gone. "Another county agency, the EPD, has forbidden me from touching the site. Can't you just talk to them, put a hold on the fine?" "Sir, that would require an interdepartmental review, for which you would have to file a petition. Form 7B/9. The processing time for that is approximately 6 to 8 weeks. 6 to 8 weeks. At $500 a day, that was a potential fine of over $20,000 just for the privilege of asking two government offices to speak to each other. It was a joke, a sick, Kafka-esque joke, where he was the only one not laughing. He slammed the phone down, the plastic cracking under the force. Yelling at the wall was useless. The wall didn't care. A cold clarity washed over him. He had been playing the victim's game, pleading, explaining, hoping for reason and fairness from a system that had none. That was over. The system wasn't. A wall to be scaled. It was a weapon to be wielded. Carol had used it to attack him. Now he would use it to defend himself. He spent the rest of the day not staring at his own ruined yard, but at hers. He sat at his kitchen table, his laptop open, and began his own investigation. He didn't search for Mr. Abernathy's secrets. He searched for Carol's. He watched her through his window as she followed her meticulous routine. 9 a.m. Weeding, 11 a.m. Mail retrieval, 3 p.m. tea on her immaculate patio. She was a creature of absolute, rigid order. And Mark knew, with the certainty of a zealot, that such rigid order was often built on a foundation of carefully hidden cracks. The first crack appeared on the county's public records website. He pulled up the official plat map for their section of Chestnut Drive, a web of black and white lines defining the neat little boxes where they all lived. He zoomed in on his lot, 114, and the adjacent lot, 112, Carol's Kingdom. And there it was. A thin dotted line running perfectly between their properties, labeled 5, Utility and Drainage Easement. His heart gave a hopeful thump. He knew what an easement was, a strip of land that, while technically part of a homeowner's property, granted access to utility companies for maintenance and repair. Homeowners were strictly forbidden from putting anything permanent on them. No sheds, no fences, no concrete patios. He looked out the window at the 5-foot strip of land between their homes. On his side, there was only grass. On her side, it was a different world. It was the heart of her gardening empire, her prize-winning. Roses, the ones she'd accused him of poisoning, were planted in a deep, mulched bed directly over the easement line. And in the center of it all, like a shrine to her horticultural obsession, was a heavy, ornate bird bath made of carved stone, clearly cemented into the ground. Mark clicked print. The plat map emerged from his printer, a black and white declaration of war. Ammunition. The taste of this small victory was intoxicating. It made him bolder. He remembered what Gus, the foreman, had said. Heard about her from another crew that did a roof on your street. He found the invoice from Suburban Solutions and dialed Gus's number. "Mark, any luck with the EPD?" Gus asked, his voice booming. "Not a drop. They've put me at the bottom of a very long list," Mark said. "Listen, Gus, you mentioned you knew some roofers who had a run-in with my neighbor. Do you remember the company's name?" There was a pause, then Gus chuckled. "Oh, yeah. Ramirez Roofing. Poor guys. She called the cops on them twice, once for their radio being too loud, and once because she claimed their truck was leaking oil on the asphalt. It was water from the AC. You thinking of getting your roof done?" "Something like that," Mark said. He found the number for Ramirez. Roofing Online. A man named Hector answered. Mark explained his situation, the hole, the cops, the fines. At first, Hector was guarded, but as Mark detailed the bureaucratic nightmare, he heard the man's sympathy grow. "Brother, I feel for you. That woman is a menace," Hector said, his voice warming. "She sat on her porch and watched my crew all day, every day for a week, taking notes, like she was some kind of general, anything to complain about." "Did you ever see anything unusual over at her place?" Mark asked, trying to sound casual. Hector was silent for a moment. "You know, it's funny you ask. From up on the roof you see everything. Behind her house, tucked away behind this big fence and some tall bushes, she's got this weird shed thing. It's got glass panels like a greenhouse, but it's built like a bunker. had a bunch of weird silver pipes coming out of the top, and a thick electrical cord running all the way back to the house, just lying on the grass. Definitely not up to code. I remember telling my brother that thing's a fire hazard waiting to happen. An unpermitted structure. An electrical code violation. The ammunition was piling up. That night, long after the last light on Chestnut Drive had been extinguished, Mark stepped into the chilling darkness of his own backyard. The yellow tape glowed faintly in the moonlight. He carried a small stepladder, his movements silent and deliberate. He placed it against the tall wooden privacy fence that separated the back of his property from Carol's. His heart hammered as he climbed the first few steps, the aluminum creaking softly. He felt like a criminal on his own land. Peering over the top, he saw her yard, a perfect, moonlit diorama. And there, just as Hector had described, tucked into the far corner, was the structure. It was a Frankenstein's monster of a building, about 10 feet by 12 feet, with a solid wooden frame and mismatched glass panels. Silver dryer vents poked from the roof at odd angles. But the most damning detail was the thick orange extension cord snaking from a port on the shed's wall across 50 feet of damp lawn to an outdoor socket on the back of her house. A clear, flagrant, and dangerous code violation. He pulled out his phone and, with a shaking hand, took several clear, time-stamped photos. The next morning, Mark didn't wake with dread. He woke with a purpose. He showered, dressed, and made a pot of coffee, moving with the calm focus of a soldier preparing his rifle. The fines were now approaching $4,000, but the number no longer terrified him. It fueled him. At precisely 9 a.m., he made his first call. "County Water and Power, how can I help you?" "Hello," Mark said, his voice level and clear. "I need to report an obstruction of a public utility easement. The address is 112 Chestnut Drive. There is extensive deep-rooted landscaping and a permanent concrete structure impeding access to underground lines. I'm concerned it could compromise utility service for the neighborhood." His second call, at 9:15 a.m., was to Henderson at Code Enforcement. "Mr. Jacobs," Henderson began, his voice flat with recognition, "I'm afraid there's no update on your case." "I'm not calling about my case, Mr. Henderson," Mark said smoothly. "I'm calling to file a new complaint for property 112 Chestnut Drive." He could almost feel the man's posture straighten on the other end of the line. "I have reason to believe there is an unpermitted detached auxiliary structure on the property. Furthermore, it appears to have improper and potentially hazardous electrical wiring. A roofing contractor who recently worked in the area can likely corroborate the structure's existence. The company's name is Ramirez Roofing." He hung up, the click of the phone feeling like the cock of a hammer. Then he took the printed plat map and walked out his front door. Carol was, as always, in her garden. She was on her knees tending to her roses, a picture of suburban tranquility. She heard his footsteps on the driveway and looked up, her face instantly hardening into a mask of contempt. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice dripping with acid. Mark didn't say a word. He walked to the edge of her lawn, right where the invisible easement line lay, and stopped. He held up the plat map, the dotted line clearly visible. "Your roses are beautiful, Carol," he said, his voice quiet, devoid of the anger she expected. "But they're planted on a county easement. So is that birdbath. That's a violation." He saw a flicker of confusion in her eyes, a tiny crack in her composure. "I also couldn't help but notice the charming little shed you have back there," he continued, his tone conversational. "I'm sure you have the permits for the structure and the electrical work." He let the words hang in the humid morning air. "I've been in touch with Code Enforcement and the utility company this morning. It seems we're both going to have our properties brought up to code." He gestured with his head back towards the gaping pit in his yard. "My problem will eventually be solved with dirt and money. Deep-rooted, prize-winning roses that have to be dug up to allow for utility access. However, or an unpermitted, illegally wired structure that needs to be torn down? Well, that's a much bigger, more expensive problem, isn't it? He watched the transformation. The color drained from her face, leaving her skin a pasty, mottled gray. Her smug superiority, the armor she'd worn for a week, disintegrated. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. For the first time, Mark saw the person beneath the caricature, a panicked, cornered womb. The silence that followed Mark's declaration was a living thing. It stretched between the two houses, thick with unspoken threats. Carol stood frozen amongst her roses, the plat map in Mark's hand acting as a death warrant for her meticulously crafted world. For a full minute, her mind seemed to be catching up to the reality of the situation. The intricate web of rules and regulations she had so expertly used to ensnare him was now closing in on her. She finally snapped her mouth shut, her face a mask of disbelief and fury, and retreated into her house without another word. The slam of her front door echoed down the quiet street. Mark walked back to his own house, his heart thudding with a mixture of grim satisfaction and a sour, churning unease. He had fired his weapon. Now, he could only wait for the impact. It came less than 24 hours later. A large, canary-yellow truck from the county water and power utility rumbled down Chestnut Drive and parked directly in front of Carol's house. A crew of 4 men in hard hats and bright orange vests emerged, led by a supervisor with a weathered face and an air of absolute impatience. They unfurled a copy of the plat map on the hood of the truck. Carol burst from her house, her cashmere cardigan replaced by a frantic energy. "What is the meaning of this? You can't just park here. This is private property." The supervisor, whose name tag read Sullivan, didn't even look up from the map. "Ma'am, we have a work order to inspect and clear the utility easement at this address. You've got extensive plantings and a concrete fixture obstructing it. We need to mark out the lines for removal." Removal? Her voice was a shrill shriek that drew the attention of neighbors. Mrs. Gable appeared in her window. Mr. Henderson paused his lawn edging. "You will do no such thing. These are award-winning hybrids. They are irreplaceable." Sullivan finally looked at her, his expression utterly devoid of sympathy. "Ma'am, with all due respect, I don't care if they're Audrey Hepburn's personal petunias. They're on a county easement. We have a legal right, in fact, a legal obligation to access our lines. Now, you can hire a landscaper to move them, or my crew can come back next week with a backhoe. Your choice. But either way, they're moving." He then pulled out a can of neon orange spray paint. As Carol watched in sputtering, impotent horror, one of the crew members walked a straight line down her perfect garden, marking a 5-foot-wide path of destruction. An orange X was sprayed directly on the stone bird bath. Her shrine had been desecrated, her kingdom publicly defaced. Each spray of the can felt like a victory to Mark, but it was a victory that tasted like ash. The next blow landed the following afternoon. A sensible county sedan pulled up, and a man in a polo shirt with a county logo embroidered on it got out. Mark recognized him from his voice. It was Henderson, from Code Enforcement, forced out from behind his desk and into the field. He held a clipboard and marched up Carol's driveway with an air of profound reluctance. Mark watched the confrontation from his kitchen window. Carol met Henderson on the porch, her voice a low, urgent murmur. She was trying to charm, to reason, to intimidate. Henderson, however, was a creature of the system. He was here because a formal complaint had been filed and corroborated. He had a procedure to follow. Mark saw him gesture towards the back of the house. Carol shook her head vehemently. Henderson just pointed at a line on his clipboard and spoke. His body language was clear. "I can either come back with the police or you can let me do my job." Defeated, Carol led him around the side of the house. 10 minutes later, they re-emerged. Henderson was scribbling furiously on his clipboard. He tore off a sheet, peeled a sticker from another, and walked with grim purpose to the side gate that led to Carol's backyard. He disappeared for a moment, then returned. Later that evening, when Mark took out his trash, he saw it. Slapped diagonally across Carol's gate was a massive blood-red sticker. In thick black letters, it read, "Notice of violation, unpermitted structure, order to demolish." The unraveling was swift and brutal. The next morning, Mark overheard a vicious, frantic argument from their patio. Carol's husband, Arthur, a man so mild-mannered and quiet Mark had nearly forgotten he existed, was finally making his presence known. "I told you we needed a permit, Carol." Arthur's voice, usually a gentle murmur, was strained with panic. "I told you, but you said, 'Don't be ridiculous, Arthur, it's just a greenhouse. No one will ever see it.'" How was I supposed to know he would resort to such tactics? Carol shrieked back. "This is retaliation. It's illegal." "It's not illegal to report a code violation." "God, Carol, do you know what the fines are for this and the demolition? We'll have to hire a crew. This is going to cost us thousands." The perfect facade of 112 Chestnut Drive was crumbling, and Mark had handed out the sledgehammers. But his satisfaction was short-lived. On Thursday morning, his phone rang. It was an unknown number. "Mr. Markham Jacobs?" The voice was female, professional, and clipped with an unfamiliar urgency. "It's Mark." "Yes, this is he." "Mr. Jacobs? This is Brenda from the Environmental Protection Department. We have a development in your case." Mark's entire body went rigid. The bored, dismissive tone he remembered was gone. This Brenda sounded like a different person. "A development?" he asked, his mouth suddenly dry. "Yes." A geologist in our cartography division was cross-referencing the initial police report with historical surveys of your area. An anomaly was flagged on your property's stratum survey from the 1970s. We are expediting your on-site inspection. An agent will be at your location tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. Please ensure the area is completely accessible. An anomaly? What kind of anomaly? Mark's mind was racing. "I thought this was about my neighbor's complaint." "The pay. Initial call was the catalyst, Mr. Jacobs, but this is no longer about a surface soil complaint," Brenda said, her voice tight. "This is now a Priority 1 EPD investigation. Our agent will explain more tomorrow, 8 a.m. The line went dead. Mark stood in his kitchen, the silence ringing in his ears. The pit in his backyard suddenly seemed miles deep. It wasn't about Carol anymore. It was never really about Carol. She had just been the fool who scraped away the topsoil to reveal the rot underneath. The cold dread he had felt on the first night returned, tenfold. The next morning at 7:55 a.m., a white van with the EPD logo pulled up. A woman in her late 40s stepped out. She had sharp, intelligent eyes and carried a durable-looking case. Carol was already watching from her window, her own considerable problems apparently forgotten in the face of this new drama. "Mr. Jacobs? I'm Dr. Eris Thorne," the woman said, shaking his hand firmly. "I'm a senior field geologist with the department." She wasn't just an inspector. She was a scientist. The dread in Mark's stomach twisted into a cold, hard knot. He led her to the backyard, to the yellow-taped chasm that had dictated his entire life for the past week. Dr. Thorne's eyes scanned the scene, her expression unreadable. She opened her case and began assembling a strange piece of equipment, a small console with a screen connected to a device that looked like a high-tech lawnmower. "Ground-penetrating radar," she explained, seeing his look. "It'll give us a picture of what's happening down below." She spent nearly an hour meticulously scanning the area, pushing the device in slow, overlapping lines around the perimeter of the pit. Then, she carefully made her way down into the hole itself. Mark watched, his heart pounding with every soft beep the machine emitted. She concentrated on the dark, oily patch of soil that had started it all. She went over, It again and again, her brow furrowed as she stared intently at the glowing screen. The neighborhood was silent, watching. Finally, she powered the machine down and climbed out of the pit, her boots caked in mud. She stood before Mark, her face grim. "Mr. Jacobs," she began, her voice low and serious. "The soil discoloration. It's not from a recent chemical spill, it's old. It's seepage." "Seepage?" Mark echoed, the word sounding foreign. "From what?" Dr. Thorne took a deep, deliberate breath, and the look in her eyes made the hair on Mark's arms stand on end. "My GPR is showing a large, high-density anomaly directly beneath this location. It's about 15 feet below the bottom of where your pool was." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "It's a metallic cylindrical object, approximately 4 feet high and 2 feet in diameter, and it's not alone. My readings indicate a cluster. At least 5 of them." Mark stared at her, uncomprehending. "What are they? What are you talking about?" "Based on the density, the dimensions, and the deep seepage pattern," she said, her voice dropping to an almost whisper. "My field analysis is consistent with sealed 55-gallon industrial drums, and Mr. Jacobs, at least one of them has been breached. Whatever Mr. Abernathy buried down there has been slowly leaking upwards towards the water table for a very, very long time." The world tilted on its axis. The strange old man, the hurried sail, the box of rocks, not a collection, but ballast, used to weigh something down before it was covered in dirt. Mark looked from the scientist's grim face to the gaping hole, and then at the neat, identical houses of Chestnut Drive. He didn't just buy a house. He had been living, sleeping, and breathing on top of a secret toxic waste dump, and Carol, in her blind, petty crusade to ruin him, had just exposed a poison that could destroy them all. The words, "industrial drums," detonated the quiet afternoon. Mark stared at Dr. Thorne, his mind struggling to bridge the gap between his suburban reality and the toxic horror she was describing. Below his feet, beneath the memory of summer, barbecues, and the spot where he'd taught his nephew to swim, lay a cache of poison. Mr. Abernathy wasn't just an eccentric recluse. He was a monster who had built his escape on a foundation of chemical sludge. Dr. Thorne was already on her phone, speaking in a clipped, urgent shorthand. "Thorne on site. Chestnut Drive. I have a confirmed GPR signature for multiple subsurface. Containers consistent with 55-gallon drums. Evidence of primary containment breach and significant vertical seepage. This is a code black. I need a full hazmat team, on-site command, and Tier 1 excavation protocols. Immediately." The world accelerated. The quiet, creeping dread of the past week was replaced by the shrieking momentum of a full-blown catastrophe. Within an hour, the single police cruiser seemed like a distant, quaint memory. Chestnut Drive was invaded. First came the sleek black SUVs of the EPD's emergency response directors. Then a mobile command center, a massive RV-like vehicle bristling with antennas, parked at the end of the street. It was followed by a convoy of large, unmarked white trucks that disgorged an army of figures in full-body Tyvek suits, their faces obscured by the reflective masks of respirators. They moved with a chilling, silent efficiency, unfurling rolls of thick red tape that read, "Danger, hazardous zone." The perimeter expanded, swallowing Mark's entire property, then Carol's, then the 2 houses across the street. The media arrived like vultures, news vans parking just beyond the red tape, their satellite dishes aimed at the sky. A helicopter buzzed overhead, its thumping blades the new heartbeat of the neighborhood. This was no longer a local dispute. This was a headline. A police officer, his face grim, knocked on Mark's door. "Sir, we're issuing a mandatory evacuation. Order for this property and the 4 adjacent homes. You have 15 minutes to gather personal necessities. We don't know when you'll be able to return." Numbly, Mark packed a bag, his hands moving on autopilot. He threw clothes, his laptop, and the useless, heavy box of Abernathy's rocks into a duffel bag, a strange compulsion he didn't understand. As he was escorted out of his own home, he saw Carol and Arthur being led from theirs. Carol's face was a ruin of slack-jawed horror. The war she had started over property lines and aesthetics had just cost her everything. All her meticulous planning, her petty rules, her perfect roses, erased by a poison she couldn't see, a threat she had personally unearthed. Days turned into a week. Mark lived in a sterile hotel room paid for by a federal emergency fund, watching his life play out on the local news. He saw his backyard, once the site of his future, transformed into a scene from another world. A massive tent-like structure was erected over the pit. Under powerful lights that burned through the night, the hazmat crews began to dig. The truth, when it was finally unearthed, was worse than Dr. Thorne's initial assessment. They found not 5, but 7 drums. They were rusted, corroded, their labels long since dissolved. One had been breached, a jagged tear in its side from which a black, tar-like substance had oozed, staining the deep earth around it a mortal, sickening black. The EPA analysis came back. It was a concentrated cocktail of tetrachloroethylene and other chlorinated solvents, a highly carcinogenic industrial degreaser whose use had been banned in 1987. The investigation into Mr. Abernathy became a federal manhunt. They found him in a low-rent retirement community in Arizona. He was a frail, shrunken man of 92. The news showed him being led away in handcuffs, his face a blank mask of senility. He'd been a chemical engineer for a manufacturing plant that went bankrupt in the late 80s, just after a massive EPA crackdown. The drums were his severance package, a secret he had literally buried under a new life, hidden in plain sight beneath the sparkling blue waters of a suburban swimming pool. The final crushing irony was reserved for Carol. As part of the containment protocol, the EPD took soil samples from a 2-block radius. Dr. Thorne herself delivered the results to Carol and Arthur at the community center where the evacuees gathered for daily briefings. Mark was there and saw it all. The plume from the breached drum has been migrating through the groundwater for years, decades perhaps, Dr. Thorne explained, pointing to a colored map. The natural gradient of the water table on your street flows from east to west. She tapped Lot 114, Mark's property. The source. Then she dragged her finger to the adjacent square, Lot 112, Carol's. The destination. The highest concentration of toxic contaminants outside of Mark's property itself was found in a 5-foot-wide strip of land running the length of Carol's yard. Your garden, Dr. Thorne said, her voice clinical but not unkind. The chemicals acted as a powerful, albeit toxic, stimulant for certain types of flora. It would have resulted in unusually vibrant growth. Carol stared at her, uncomprehending. Then a slow, dawning horror crept into her eyes. Her prize-winning roses, her ribbons, her trophies, her neighborhood dominance, it had all been nourished by a chemical lie. Her pride was literally poison-fed. She had spent years tending to a toxic waste site, calling it a garden. She made a small, choked sound and crumpled into a chair, her carefully constructed world finally irrevocably gone. Months later, Chestnut Drive was a ghost of its former self. Mark's house and Carol's house had been demolished, scraped from the face of the earth. In their place were 2 massive, fenced-off lots of raw, barren dirt, littered with monitoring wells and warning signs. The federal government had declared it a Superfund cleanup site. The property values of the entire neighborhood had plummeted. No one had won. Mark sat in a lawyer's downtown office, the city skyline gleaming outside the window. The air smelled of paper and ambition. He signed the last page of a thick document. It was the settlement agreement. The federal government, through a victim compensation fund, was buying his toxic land and providing a substantial sum for relocation and damages. It wasn't a lottery win. It was an apology, a reimbursement for a life that had been stolen. As he left the building, a television in the lobby was playing a midday news program. The lead story was an update on the Chestnut Drive chemical scare. They showed an image of Mr. Abernathy, who had died in custody before he could stand trial. Then, they showed an aerial view of the two empty lots, ugly brown squares cut out, of the green suburban patchwork. Mark clutched the settlement check in his jacket pocket. He looked out at the bustling, anonymous city. He had his fresh start. The clean slate he had craved was finally his. He had wanted to erase a pool, a small symbol of a life he wanted to forget. Instead, the hole he had dug had grown, consuming everything: his home, his neighbor's life, an entire street's peace of mind. He had to be wiped off the map to finally be free of it. He hailed a cab and gave the driver the address of a temporary apartment, a place with no yard, no neighbors, and no history. It was a victory, but it felt like survival. The ultimate karma had been served, raining down on everyone with terrifying impartiality. And as the cab pulled into traffic, leaving the gleaming office tower behind, Mark knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that some holes can never truly be filled, not tools.